Izzy at Minerva. Today we're looking at how to use our bespoke trouser block to make a pair of trousers that have a pin tuck detail in them. This is shown in the image next to me right now, and you can see what we're going to do is to create a nice little curved waistband, effectively, or waist detail, and then we're going to add a number of little pin tuck details down the front of the trousers. That creates volume. In addition, we're also, because we're adding that volume in, I also just want to straighten off the legs at that point. So we're creating a much sort of wider, more palazzo style trouser. And so this is the palazzo trouser with pin tuck detail, and this is exactly what we're going to be creating today. Now, when we're looking at the pin tuck technique and the tuck technique, there are lots of different types of tucks. You can do a deep delve into this if you want to. However, the terminology pin tucks comes from the concept that the tuck is about a pin's width, or up to 3 millimeters. So in order to make our life slightly easier today, we are going to use the maximum pin tuck width of 3 millimeters in total. We're just going to do a nice little series down the front of the trousers of pin tucks. So let's do that and let's have a lot of fun as we do it. In today's video, I'm going to be talking you step by step how to do this alteration, and you can follow along using your block at home. So go and grab your pattern drafting tools, which are listed right next to me here. Go and grab those and just make sure that you've got your block in front of you, traced over it. We're going to be cutting into that block quite a lot, so don't use your original block. Make sure you trace it before you follow along at home. In today's video, I am wearing the Riffle and Ruffle dress by Izzy Studio, and we'll tag that pattern below the video. Now, in today's video, I'm going to be using fat Sharpie marker pens, so you can clearly see on the screen above what I'm doing and demoing. However, at home, please do use a nice sharp pencil to keep everything as accurate as possible, especially with the pin tucks, because they are very detail orientated. Okay, so in front of us here, we've got our front trouser block and our back trouser block. I'm just going to pop the back trouser block to one side, and we're going to start with the front. Okay, to start off with, I just want to create this nice shaped panel up at the top. I'm going to mark a point that is 5 centimeters along the side seam from the waist. Okay, so what we want to do is find a nice soft curve which just comes in at the bottom of the dart to start off with. So working from the side seam, we're just going to draw that in. And what that does is it just removes the complexity of that dart out of our pin tuck demonstration that we're going to be doing. I do think what would be really nice at this point is just to add a little notch at this point here. We don't want to overcomplicate it, but when we're putting it together, it might be a bit tricky if we don't add some little notches in. So this is just going to help us when we attach those two bits together. So you can then just cut out the volume of the top section. And now we've got this top section up here, we're just going to remove the volume out of the dart. So just cut along one side and then just close up that dart by joining the two dart lines together. Now, when we're looking at the trouser leg, the first thing I want to do is just to widen those legs at the bottom. If you're not sure how to do this, please refer back to video 108, where I talk about how to do this in a lot more detail and sort of explain the maths a little bit more. If you're happy just to follow along, that's fine. I'm just going to widen the legs by 2 centimeters. It's not a significant amount, but it's enough to make a bit of a difference. So we're going to do that, and then we're just going to send that line all the way up to the leg seam, straight up, making sure that our ruler line is lined up with the hem down here. Just draw that in. When you get up to the top up here, we're just going to curve it off until it joins the seam nice and elegantly. And the same for the other side. Line up your ruler and draw that line in. Okay, let's add those little pin tucks in now. I'm going to add 7 pin tucks all the way down the front of each leg of the trouser. So we're going to use this line here that we originally drafted as the center of the leg where we want to place the pin tucks from. Okay, to start off with, let's decide how long we want our pin tucks to be. So we've got a nice little curve here. We could drop them down to the hip, we could drop them down to the knee if we wanted to. It's still gonna fit because this is our block. I'm going to do a series of tucks that stop 3 centimeters above the hip line. So I'm just going to draw a line 3 centimeters above the hip line. Okay, nice. So start off just by drawing a line that is 1 centimeter offset from that center line there. This is going to be effectively where our stitch line is going to run down from that point down to the end of the pleat. So depending on how many tucks you want, draw that number of lines. But we are going to extend those lines all the way down. Next, we're going to cut along each of those lines, all the way from the bottom up to the top. Once you've cut out the first one, we're just going to shift it to the side, and I'm just going to put some line markings onto our paper underneath, just so that we've got a nice clear reference point for our knee line and also for our hem line. And let's also add one in for our crotch line up here. It's just going to help to keep everything nice and even. And I'm actually going to do one for the bottom line here, which is 3 centimeters above the hip line, because that's where our pleats, our little tucks, because that's where our little tucks are going to stop. Okay. Now our pin tucks are only going to be 3 millimeters wide when you look at them, but don't forget you've got the folded fabric underneath, so we need to add in 6 millimeters of volume for each pin tuck that we choose to do. So using your ruler, we're very nice and neatly going to add 6 millimeters offset to the first cut line. Now on this ruler, the bottom red line just above that number 1 is actually 6 millimeters, so that's really nice and easy to just use as your reference. Okay, so now we're going to cut out this strip and we're going to line it up with this one so that we've added in the little bit of volume that we needed to. Okay, so this cut strip is just going to move across and line up with that line that we just drew onto our paper. Using our reference points that we have here, we can then just stick that down. Okay, doesn't that look really pretty with all the little pleats all added in? Amazing. So those are all the adaptations that we need to make to the front trouser leg. We're going to go and grab some tracing paper and add our seam allowances and annotations. I'm not adding a hemline, so just draw that straight in. Draw a 1.5 centimeter seam line to the inner leg seam, and a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance to the side seam of the leg. Draw in a seam allowance to the top section. This section up here is all sort of going to be curved off anyway, but just mark a 1.5 centimeter kind of offset at regular intervals along that shape, just so you've got a bit of a guideline for what to draw in. And then let's just draw it quite simply. Draw in your 1.5 centimeter to your crotch line. Just going to add my knee notch at this point, and also my hip notch, so I've got that reference with the back. Using a nice sharp pen, you're going to want to draw in these little pin tucks really accurately. So starting up at this red line here, I'm just going to draw in a line that goes all the way up to the top, and that then becomes my stitch line for my pin tuck. Just repeat that all the way along for each of those little sections where you're going to be doing the pin tuck. And don't forget to add your notches where we had them before, so they're going to line up with this piece up here. Now the grain line still runs perpendicular with the knee line. Palazzo trousers with pin tucks, front trouser cut 2. Great. Okay, let's move on now and do the top yoke. For this top section, we're just going to find a nice soft curve just to even out that curve and make it just a bit more gentle. We're going to add our seam allowance to the bottom. Again, we just want to curve around that section where there's a bit of a point. So just find that nice soft curve. You can draw it on and just tidy it up if you feel like you need to once you've drawn it on. Something like that, it's looking good. Add your seam allowance to your side seam. But then the centre front can actually be cut on the fold. Now then, the grain line is going to run parallel with the centre front, as usual. And we're just going to add in our notches. Lovely, great. Once you've done that, we're going to move on to the back pattern piece. Now, before we move on to our back pattern piece, there's a couple of dimensions that we just want to write down. The first one is working out what the length is of this section here along the side seam, because obviously our yoke on our back sort of extended waistline needs to be the same. So for me, side seam yoke is 6 centimetres. The other thing that I want to measure is how much I added in to the trouser leg at the bottom down here. So down here we added 6 millimetres into each little gap, didn't we? So we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 little gaps. So 0.6 of a centimetre times 9 gives us 5.4 centimetre volume is how much we added in with that. But then we also added 2 centimetres here and 2 centimetres here. So then we're going to add 2 centimetres and then another 2 centimetres for that and that section. So the overall width increase, the hem, was 9.4 centimetres for me. Make sure you've got those calculations for yourself before we move on to the back trouser. Okay, so we've got our back trouser leg here. The first thing I want to do is just draw in this back yoke up here. Now my side seam back yoke was 6 centimetres depth on the front. So along the side seam over here, I'm just going to mark a point that is 6 centimetres below the natural waistline. Now at this point, you can shape this however you want. You could pop a nice little curve on it, kind of come down. I want the line to cut through the bottom of this one here and just graze around the bottom of that one there, simply because it's going to make drafting this section a little bit easier. So let's cut out that yoke now. I'm then just going to cut out those darts, and then I'm just going to place and close up those darts really nicely. So we had the dart there and we're just closing it up. Now we don't really want these sharp points down here, so I'm just going to sort of curve these off a little bit, just so we've got a bit of a softer experience down there. Now with the bottom of our leg, the bottom leg, we need to remember that for the front, we extended the leg by 2 centimetres to start off with. So we're going to do that same step for the back leg. So just mark a point that is 2 centimetres offset from the side seam and the inner leg seam down at the hem line. Then we're just very simply going to extend that line all the way up in a straight line. Where it hits the leg, again, we can just sort of curve it off to create a nice soft curve there. And just repeat that process for the other side. We don't want the length of the trouser to get any longer, so just mark the bottom of the trouser leg at that point there, and then we're just going to find a nice soft curve from one side down to the centre. So down like that, and on this side too. Now, rather than create pin tucks for the back as well as the front, I'm just simply going to widen the leg by the same amount as I did on the front, and we're just going to put some nice little gathers in the back. Okay, working along the knee line, calculate the length of the line at the knee line. So for me it's 27, and just divide that by 4. So for me it's 6.7. Then we're going to divide this line into quarters using that reference as a guide. So for me, I'm dividing it into equal 6.7 centimetre offsets. And obviously this is your centre line along the knee line, so that should be one of them. And then we're simply just going to send that line all the way up to the top and straight down to the bottom as well. Cut along those 3 lines. Just extend the knee line onto the sheet of paper below, and also the hip line. So, referring back to our original hem width increase, the front was increased by 9.4 centimetres. So I'm going to tap that length into my calculator. Then we've already done and added 2 centimetres here and 2 centimetres here. So I'm going to minus 2 centimetres minus another 2 centimetres, 5.4. So 5.4 is the amount that we want to increase the overall volume between each of these sections. So we've got 1, 2, 3 sections that we can increase evenly, distribute the extra volume evenly across the back of the trouser leg. So I'm going to divide that amount by 3 and I've got 1.8. So in a very similar way to what we did with the other pattern piece, I'm going to mark along the knee line 1.8 centimeters and up at the hip line 1.8, and then down here I'm just going to mark off a point 1.8. Grabbing the next panel piece along, I'm just going to line that up with my 1.8 centimeter marker reference points and just stick it down in place. Just repeat that process for the other two. Okay, that's all we need to do. Let's add our tracing paper and make our pattern pieces. Just going to draw in the hemline at the bottom, adding no seam allowance. Add your seam allowance to your side seams, and the same for the other side. Add that centre back seam. Now then, what we want to try and do here is just sort of find the basic curve between all of these. What I might do is just grab a pencil and just sort of do it by hand. I think sometimes that's just a little bit easier, isn't it? Just to sort of say, yeah, this is sort of where I want my line to be. And then just add your 1.5 centimeter seam allowance to your top once you've kind of worked out where you think your line in the curve needs to be at that point. Okay, let's add our notches. So we're going to add our notches to our hip line and at the knee line as well. So at 1.5 centimeter offset from the side seams, add a little line at that point. And then you can just do a little dash line that just says the word gather, so that you remember to gather between those notches. Grain line runs perpendicular to the knee line. Palazzo trousers with pin tucks, back trouser leg, cut 2. Great, let's move on to our yoke pattern piece. Again, we're going to have a zip down the side seam, so we can just cut the centre back on the fold. And then we'll just find a nice soft curve around the top of the waistband up here. Add the seam allowance to the side seam so we can sew it to the front. And another one, the side seam at the bottom of the yoke so it can attach onto the trousers. Place on fold. Grain line runs parallel with the centre back. Now, I have just realised that I've told you to put a seam allowance on the top of the waistband, which we're obviously not doing because we're not creating a facing today. So just rectify that if you're following at home and just follow the top of the waistband like that, please. Brilliant. So let's cut out those 2 back trouser pattern pieces and then we'll cut them out of fabric, making sure to transfer all of our line markings, and then off we go with our sewing. We'll start off by looking at our back trouser leg. So just taking a look at one of these legs, we've got a notch up at the top, another notch here. We want to run 2 lines of gathering stitches along the top. These are going to be basting stitches. We're going to reinforce the stitch at the beginning and leave a long thread at the end. The first line of stitches will be 5mm from the raw edge, and the second line of stitches will be 1 centimetre from the raw edge. Okay, so we've marked the wrong side of the fabric with a nice big X, so we know that's the wrong side. What we want to do now is put right sides together and just sew this inner crotch seam, just like that. Then we're just going to press that seam towards one side. Okay, right side is now facing up on the screen, and what we want to do now is sew our yoke to our back. So the first thing I'm going to do is just pin the V straight into the seam here so that we know we've got a really nice accurate V at this point. Brilliant. Then just pulling it round to one side, we're going to line up the notches up at the side seam, and I'm just going to pin that in place. Now you'll notice that we've got a nice big amount of fabric to gather here at this point, so I'm just going to flip it round and pull on the 2 strings of the 2 runs of stitches, and just pull those strings until the length of the trouser leg is the same as the yoke. Just distribute those gathers nice and evenly and then just pin in place. Once you've done one side like that, we're just going to repeat that process for the other side. So just going to rotate that yoke over so that the right side of the yoke is touching the side seam over here now. Pin that in place, and then we'll just flip it over to gather the back leg in the same way we did the other side. Lovely. Once you've gathered both back legs and attached them and pinned them to the yoke, we're just going to sew those in place using the standard 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Lovely. That's looking really cute. Let's go and press that in place. Great. Let's move on to our front trouser pattern piece next. Now at the top of our trousers here, we've marked where all of our pin tucks are. And so we're going to work with the first one down here and pinch the fabric together like we would if we were doing a dart. Using your pins, just make sure that the pins are going through both sides of the fabric and running through the carbon paper dots just to ensure nice and accurate pin tucks. Next, we're going to sew down that line really carefully using our carbon paper dots as our stitch line reference. So you can see here that the stitch line is running through the carbon paper dots on both sides of the fabric. Once you've sewn one, continue just to sew the other pin tucks in a similar manner. Once you've sewn all the pin tucks on one leg, just press them towards the side. Then we're just going to get both trouser legs, put them right side together and pin and sew the crotch line here. Wonderful, so our front trouser legs are almost complete. We just need to add our front yoke. So on the wrong side of the yoke, I'm just going to mark a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance on the bottom of the yoke so that I can tell where the point of the V should be on the yoke. And I'm doing that just simply by marking the seam allowance on the wrong side of the fabric. And I get a nice sharp V at that point. And now with the right sides together, we're just going to pin the yoke to the trouser leg. And then once that's pinned in place, sew using your standard seam allowance. Okay, so there we have it, a nice sharp point down the centre front, and all of our little pin tucks are beautifully sewn. Okay, we're now going to sew the front to the back on the trousers. We're going to pin both side seams and the inner seam together, but don't forget to leave a space for the zip opening on the left side of the trouser leg. Great, and once you've sewn it, press those seams open and let's go and see what it looks like. Here are our palazzo trousers, looking fantastic. Those pin tuck details are just so cute. You can imagine if they were extended all the way down right to the hem, that would just add in a whole significant detail all the way down, but how we've done it here, it just adds in the detail at the top, keeping it nice and fitted on the top, and then flows out down to the bottom, which is also lovely. And so that completes our palazzo trouser with pin tuck details. Hope you found all those little techniques really interesting. We did pack that episode with a lot of technical details. So I hope you've really enjoyed that. It's been really fun to follow along at home. As ever, if you've got any comments, feel free to post them below the video. We always love to hear from our maker community here at Minerva. So thank you for joining me today. I'll see you next week as we continue our trouser drafting series.